To those who are slowly joining in, we are just giving this a few minutes. I think we'll start in about a minute or two. We're just waiting for everyone to join. So we have about 100 attendees who have joined so far, and we will just give it a minute just to ensure that we catch any slightly latecomers. And Nick, I'll hand over to you then when you are ready and comfortable to begin. I'll let you take over, and I think the panelists can keep their videos on for now. But then when Nick begins his intro, I think, and then after that, I think we can turn the panelist videos off and move to the presentation. And just a note that to all attendees that this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed in an email along with a write-up of this webinar to all attendees and those who registered. Over to you, Nick.
Okay, thanks very much. On behalf of Trialogue and Institute of Directors, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar. We're covering a topic of interest to many players in the ESG field. We've had over 500 participants that have signed up for this session, so that just gives an indication of how of interest the topic is. I must thank IODSA for partnering with Trialogue on this event. Many of you will have heard about the webinar through them. Julie Dixon from IODSA will provide the closing comments a bit later on. For those of you who do not know Trialogue, we're a business that focuses on the relationship between business and society, offering thought leadership via our conferencing, publications, online platforms, as well as advisory services. We've compiled numerous sustainability and integrated reports over the years, and we have a particular passion for integrated thinking on embedding ESG within the core of the business. Our work in this field goes back to the early 2000s, having compiled a publication in March 2004 titled The Good Corporate Citizen, Pursuing Sustainable Business in South Africa. That's over 18 years ago, and looking at the topics we covered in that publication, it's incredible to see how many remain relevant today. But whilst the issues that we are addressing haven't changed that significantly over the years, the attention that this field has attracted and the way that companies are responding has changed dramatically. Back then, speaking to companies about sustainability was seen as somewhat left field. Nice to have, certainly not essential. It was difficult to find someone in the business that was dedicated to this function, and highly unlikely to find an executive who paid it much attention. I always felt that for things to change, investors and shareholders needed to get involved. We fast track to today, we find companies with teams managing ESG, a plethora of codes and standards driving behavior, reporting awards, and investors are asking questions to companies, drawing on the analysis of ESG raters and rankers for guidance. So that brings us to the topic of today. What do we make of raters and rankers? How are their services being utilized? What value do they bring to the field? And how should companies respond? I would like to welcome our panelists to this session who will share insights on the topic from their different perspectives. Anne Lepile from Alexander Forbes Investments CEO, Marina Madale, MTN Group GM, Sustainability and Shared Value, Shamila Subramani, JSE Chief Sustainability Officer, and Matt Worthington-Smith, Farsight Chief Operating Officer. And I'm going to hand you over to Lee Swan from Emergence Africa, who will be providing a short introductory presentation on the topic. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Nick. It really is always a pleasure to collaborate with the Trialogue team on all things sustainability. And thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts today on this very interesting and very complex issue. Matthew, if you could share my slides, please. Great, if you could just go on to the next slide, perfect. So by now it should come as no surprise that there's an expectation on business and investors to take sustainability and within it ESG factors into consideration when going about their work. So the drivers behind this expectation are increasing in number and complexity, both internationally and locally. Now, it would be foolish for me to try and list all of the changes that are happening and that are driving this fundamental change in our business environment. But within our local context, there are a few important ones. One of those is really the strengthening alignment with the codes, with a number of codes, such as the Principles for Responsible Investing, as well as our local code for responsible investing in South Africa. There are significant changes that happened a few years ago with regards to Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act, which these changes made an explicit requirement to take sustainability into account in how investment decisions relating to pension funds are made. So quite a significant change in the capital markets. There are similar emerging pressures within the banking sector with the emergence of responsible banking, as well as other sectors in the capital markets. Now, and by now, most people will be familiar with the National Treasury Draft Green Finance Taxonomy, that's quite a mouthful, as well as the emerging climate change legislation in South Africa, such as the Climate Change Bill. We also have a number of industry bodies offering guidance on ESG issues and how to integrate these into decision-making processes, including, for example, the CFA Institute globally. And over many years, the pressure to improve corporate governance practices has grown, and as a result, there's a strengthening alignment with good governance practices, such as those recommended in the King 4 report on corporate governance. Aspects of which have found their way into the listing requirements for the JSE here in our local environment. And to add to that, there are a number of investors and companies making commitments towards achieving net zero emissions. And this is an indication of a growing intent to take climate change within the spectrum of sustainability very seriously. And of course, within our local market, there's emerging guidance on how best to take sustainability issues into consideration. The recently published JSE Sustainability Disclosure Guidance and the associated JSE Climate Disclosure Guidance are examples of that. Next slide, please, Matthew. Perfect. So within this context, we're already seeing a number of the custodians of capital considering ESG factors within their investment decisions, and that their methods of assessing ESG risk and opportunities are starting to become a lot more mature. Most of the large pension funds and asset managers locally, as well as the smaller ones, are already demonstrating a declared intent to take sustainability and ESG issues within it into account, and very seriously. It'll be quite interesting to hear from our panelists later on, Anne Lepili, about how Alex Forbes is taking this issue into account and how they make decisions. So we are definitely seeing an emergence of a number of specialized ESG linked investment funds, as well as a number of interesting products that are now emerging, with a number of green bonds already being launched. And I see that now next week, Barlow World is also going to be launching a gender linked bond, which will be quite an interesting one to watch. Next one, next slide, please, Matthew. So it's quite clear that change is definitely afoot, and that ESG factors are becoming increasingly important in our business environment. Most of the large ratings agencies and data providers have launched ESG ratings within their suite of products, and there are also a number of boutique raters and rankers that have emerged. Farsight in South Africa is a good example of that. So it's good to have Matthew from Farsight on the panel for a discussion about this later on. And whilst all of this shows sign that there's definite demand in the market for ESG information and ratings, it's quite a complex space. Anybody who's worked in this space with the ratings will know that for sure. So each company tends to have their own approach in assessing ESG, which can lead to a fair amount of complexity. Next slide, please, Matthew. So it would be fair to say that there is a strong body of evidence emerging that suggests that companies which perform better with ESG matters also tend to deliver higher returns. This is demonstrated by multiple indexes, including ESG linked indexes from MSCI. old mutual indexes, and also the JSE responsible investing indexes. So research from organizations such as Farsight appeared to support this premise as well. Next slide, Matthew. However, there's also a growing school of thought which suggests exactly the opposite, including a very recent and significant study by NetSPA in June 2022, which appears to suggest that there is no link between ESG and returns at all. This is a study which covers over 9,000 stocks and 46 countries over a 20-year period. So it's not something that should be dismissed easily. And in parallel, there are also pockets of research underway which are attempting to investigate whether the perceived link between ESG and performance is causative or simply correlative in nature. Quite an important question. So it's fair to say that opinions on the matter are not always aligned. Next slide, please. So to add to that, there is often quite significant divergence in the outcomes of ESG ratings by the various agencies. In many cases, one rating will be completely the opposite of another on any particular issue. So it's not particularly helpful that there's not alignment, but it does give you a sense of the complexity of these issues. So research is now suggesting that these differences can broadly be attributed to three key things. The first being this scope divergence, so different organizations taking different scopes of ESG issues into consideration in terms of what they consider to be material. Then measurement divergence. This would include varying approaches taken to measure the exact same ESG issue, different ways to and philosophies to measure that issue. That's fairly prolific in the governance side of things. And then also weighting divergence. So each of the rating agencies tends to make an informed decision, I guess, on what ratings to attribute to various material ESG issues within their calculations. So this is all starting to sound quite complicated, right, rather than simple. Next slide, please, Matthew. So I think part of the problem is that ESG ratings are often thought of as being similar in their level of quality and maturity as credit ratings, because often they are issued by organizations which are very credible in issuing credit ratings. But this really is not the case for a number of key reasons. So credit rating methodologies in context are very mature in their approach and they're better understood by their users. Whereas ESG rating methodologies are relatively new, they offer a different approach, and they are largely not really understood in detail by the people that use them at this stage, in my opinion. Secondly, credit rating methodologies are built to offer insight into a very specific, clear, and singular question. Essentially, how probable is it that an assessed company will default on a line of credit? Whereas there is limited clarity and alignment on definitions with regards to ESG ratings, including a lack of alignment on what ratings or data products are intending to measure. There's also a lack of transparency with regards to methodology underpinning these ratings, and ESG issues are complex, multifaceted, dynamic, and the approaches to ESG performance of companies is still relatively immature. So quite different from credit ratings. Credit ratings are also backed by very strong data sets, which enable the prediction of the likelihood of a default based on really thousands of data points gathered over many years. And this creates the ability to identify early warning signs, which may predict a credit default. So quite helpful. However, ESG ratings don't have that same depth in terms of historical data or enough data to convincingly establish the exact relationship between ESG performance and future financial performance or returns. Credit ratings are also usually reliant on fully audited data points, whereas ESG ratings are largely reliant on self-reported information, which in many cases is not completely externally assured, even if it is in parts. So you get the effect of rubbish in and rubbish out in some cases. And then there are also very significant blind spots with regards to unlisted companies in the market. So whilst many unlisted companies can be very large in size and significant in our economy, they can also be frequently assessed for credit ratings for the purposes relaying this information to various stakeholders. However, ESG performance and reporting transparency is very immature, in my opinion, with respect to unlisted companies. Next slide, Matthew. So really, what does this mean for us, and do ESG ratings and rankings have any value? So I bet by now you're expecting me to say that they have no value, given how complex and divergent they are. But in truth, I really believe that ESG ratings and rankings and any other ESG related research have immense value, despite the current lack of alignment on methodologies and opinions. Given that ESG ratings and rankings are really in their infancy, this early stage of development is an essential step to enable a detailed debate and analysis of various approaches and their outcomes, with a view to improving these methodologies and understanding them over time. Whilst the future of ESG ratings, in my opinion, is likely to become even more complex and noisy in the short term, in the longer term, I think the approach to ESG factors will likely improve as a result of the current debate, the dissection, attack, and defense of various methodologies. So in the meantime, and in any event, any party which is acting as a fiduciary, and that includes directors of companies, asset managers, fund managers, have an obligation to understand any and all factors which may have a material impact on the decisions that they take. Material ESG issues fall within this remit automatically, with or without regulation. If, in the execution of fiduciary duties, ESG ratings and ranking scores and data are utilized, the methods by which these are calculated must be properly understood and not simply taken at face value. As a party with a fiduciary duty, it is your obligation to look under the hood and to understand how ESG information that you are using is constructed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. That was a very insightful presentation, and on the latest and thinking around raters and rankings. Before we move on to the panel discussion, we're going to run a quick poll, and as we do that, I'd just like to share with the attendees how the session will run from here on out. I'll introduce again the panelists. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to present on the topic. Thereafter, I've got a couple of questions for them, so the Q&A with Trialogue, and then in the final part of the webinar, it opens to the floor. So you can use the Q&A function, the chat function, to ask any questions, and I can ask those questions to the panelists, or you can raise your hand at that point, and we can hand it over to you, and you can have the floor for a question to any of the panelists, and as well as Lee, who's presented now. So if you have any questions for Lee, you can ask. The panelists and the presenter, Lee, are also welcome to answer any questions that you may have for them in the Q&A function. So let's keep the debate going and keep it alive. So then, as people are answering this first question, what is the typical level of response by listed companies to input from raters and rankers? And we're starting to see sort of quite a clear picture of you know, a lot of the participants saying that the substance but not the detail of inputs is important, and also the selective and superficial attention is considered and responded to from just a few raters and rankers. So each and every input from raters and rankers is seriously considered and adopted wherever possible, not as much, only 8% coming through there really, and a response by exception. So if something stands out, also not as great, and then very few people are ignoring raters and rankers. So very much most of the participants in their experience are somewhere in the middle. So probably on the right track. But I'm sure these insights will also be of use to the panelists as we get into their discussions. So then let me just run through the panelists again. So Nick introduced the panelists to you today, and what we will do is we will hand over to Anne from Alex Forbes to present on the topic for 5 minutes, and then over to Marina from MTN's perspective in terms of how they see raters and rankers in terms of from a sustainability point of view at MTN. Shamila then will just discuss a little elements of double materiality and the insights from developing the JSE sustainability standard guidelines. And then lastly, from Matt Worthington-Smith, some insights from the Farsight model that has sort of won awards for the last couple of years in terms of best ESG research in the Intellidex FM rankings. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Anne, and Anne, you may now share your screen.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Let me see how quickly and efficiently I can do this. Give me one sec.
And if you can just put into slideshow presentation mode, thank you.
Yeah, it's on its way. There we go.
There we go.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. As Matthew has already said, my name is Anne Bepile, and I am here to represent our view in terms of how we approach ESG ratings and rankers. Obviously, as has already been said, the topic of sustainability has gathered quite a bit of momentum globally over the past few years, and we've not been spared from that momentum. Many investors and asset allocators alike are finding themselves with a myriad of indices, rating agencies, as well as policies and compacts to contend with. It is a lot, especially for what we call the simple investor, our members. What exactly is the objective of ESG ratings? At Alex Forbes, while we have an internal ESG rating process, we also look to external ratings to complement our own ESG integration into our portfolios. It is important, however, to remember that we've been bestowed a privilege in managing our members' money, and it's important to make sure that we do it in a responsible fashion, taking into consideration a South Africa specific lens, taking into consideration the fact that what we do find is a number of these integration of ESG processes and ratings do add to the cost of investments. So as sustainability as a concept heats up, many providers have entered the market, as you can see in this slide. We are really finding ourselves grappling with the lack of standardization of methodologies, which does make it quite difficult for us to rank the rankers. UN Global Compact really simply requires a commitment to people and planet. And maybe as a South African investor, that's really the measurement that we need to be looking at. But importantly, also the measurement of that and the cost of that really does vary amongst the different providers that we engage with. We are, as one of South Africa's largest fund allocators, really plagued with provider fatigue. How does one define a credible rating? Why should it add so much to the cost of investment if it is meant to do good? And how do we make it make sense in a country like ours? Back to the South Africa landscape. As a South African, we have to understand that we have our very own, very difficult and very different challenges relative to a developed world. Should we reconsider, ESG and call it SEG, given the fact that we have got far greater social problems than a developed economy would possibly have? What takes priority in a country like South Africa? Do global ratings account for country specifics in a way that is meaningful or impactful to our members? Global ratings often have a very first world view in our mind, and that makes it very challenging when you look at it and you are sitting in a developing economy plagued with high unemployment, such as South Africa. Should we also not be considering the impact of adverse ratings on some companies and what it means for potential employment levels in our country? This is where we find that local providers of ratings are often better able to understand that we do need specific ESG nuances to cater for country-specific challenges that we may find ourselves plagued with. So once again, talking to the frustration at the myriad of ratings offers out there, there's also an understanding that standardization, like I said earlier, does mean that there's a lack of country-specific nuance. This slide that I've got up here shows that a global checklist approach tends to add very little value in our minds. Most corporates want checklist approaches to cross off and simply move on, rather than genuinely deal with the issues that are affecting their own markets and their own countries. Dealing with actual ESG issues cannot be outsourced to a checklist, to a ratings agency, or to ratings providers. Ratings are valuable inputs, but the responsibility must remain an internal responsibility. A recent study by McKinsey's on sustainability reporting actually suggested that most investors and executives would prefer a reduction in sustainability standards. The preference for consolidation, in short. Investors also do prefer to have this drafted into law. And honestly, when we look at Regulation 28, it sort of makes sense to go with regulated impact. That way it's easy for everybody to simply say, this is exactly what we need to do, and we get it out the way. In the study, however, executives were the ones who had a slightly lower preference to having a legal precedent set. So what does this mean for Alex Forbes and how we use our ratings? Obviously, as Lee said earlier in the presentation, the listed asset process of ESG rating is a lot easier. Where there is data, there is an ability to rank and rate. The unlisted market is a slightly different kettle of fish, and Forbes has a alternative approach to that. We don't ignore that particular sector. But importantly, we want to see the integration of ESG into our investment processes. Rating agencies will provide the data behind the process, but we do still expect analysis from our asset managers, which we allocate money to. Corporate engagement in our minds is highly encouraged. What you do as a fund manager once you're sitting with an adverse ESG rating is obviously more important to us. In our view, exclusion should not be encouraged. Exclusion does not bring about change. Engagement forces management to listen to shareholders. This is where we find ourselves challenged as a business by the growing number of ESG indices, particularly in the Europe and the US sectors. A lack of investor support in many of these companies in many of these countries with these ESG indices will have, as a result, a loss of jobs. And when you are sitting in South Africa, once again, this is not something we can really afford, specifically when you are relating to countries where the GDP is heavily reliant on a lot of mining companies, which are often not included in these ESG indices. We also overlay external ESG ratings with our own ESG process and ranking in-house. And effectively, we are saying that one is really a leader in integrating ESG into their process. They are able to show us how they reach valuations based on an understanding of ESG processes and how they've engaged with company management, oftentimes how they've brought about change, either in remuneration policies, in diversity and inclusion in the corporates. That is very important for us in assessing the quality of a manager's ESG integration. I think I've obviously run out of time in terms of my 5 minutes, but I'd really like to end off by saying that ESG and sustainability is a learning journey for us as a business. We are by no means saying that we are the be all and end all in terms of the way forward. Ratings need to offer an understanding of the actual challenges faced by investors to show actual impact. Let's understand the purpose of ESG beyond a checklist. In our mind, that purpose is to leave a sustainable world for those that come after us. Growth, employment, diversity and inclusion, and most importantly, a responsible green transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was really, really interesting insights from Alex Forbes. As a large multi-manager in this country with a huge amount of billions of rands under your assets under management. So thank you very much for those insights into ESG.
Thank you.
So then if I can hand over to Marina from MTN to share some of her insights. So over to you, Marina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thanks for the opportunity to share MTN's experience today. So I won't be putting up any presentations. I'd really like just to try and have a conversation and share some key insights. So as MTN, most of you know, we're in the telecommunications sector and specifically operating in about 19 markets in Africa and the Middle East. One of our key drivers and our core belief underpinned in the company is this notion that everyone deserves the benefits of a modern connected life. In basic terms, it's about driving digital and financial inclusion. And at the heart of it is our sustainability approach, which is about driving impact and sharing of value. Now, we as an organization recognize the importance of ESG as it helps to quantify the impact that we're having and to be able to gauge and dipstick and journey ahead. Now, there is absolutely no question on the importance of ESG raters and rankers and broader standards. As an organization, we see this really as a very important and key part of almost doing a dipstick of where we are. What we are seeing with our broader footprint, we are listed obviously on the JSE. So I'm glad to see Shamila on here today. And I think the JSE has done a lot from a stock exchange perspective to help drive sustainability and for many years and continues to enhance what it's doing. We are also seeing similar kind of practices coming up in Nigeria, in Ghana, and so forth, especially as we are listed. Now, the key thing, especially for ourselves as an operator in an emerging market context, when we look at ESG raters and rankers, as the previous speakers have mentioned, not a lot of them cater for the emerging market reality. There are some that in the very core and methodology, they do build in emerging market factors, sector-specific factors, and so forth. So there is some tailor-making, but it's not consistent. And in some instances, some of the bigger ones where it really counts do not have that. So I think that's something that, you know, as a corporate, we continue to engage and to encourage is to make sure that it's adapted to the realities of the type of markets we operate in. I think another really important thing is that a lot of the speakers have spoken about the fact that there's quite a lot of raters and rankers. There's many of them, and I think the question starts to become, how do you approach them? Where do you start when there's so many? For us as an organization, we've worked with various partners like ERM and so forth, and we've started to start prioritizing and ranking them, looking at aspects like influence, reputation, linkages. You'd be surprised to know that there's a lot of raters and rankers that integrate into one another, an example of which is Bloomberg. If you go on the Bloomberg ESG raters and rankers, you're able to see a company's Sustainalytics results, Bloomberg results, and others. So you're starting to see this shift that's happening as we are seeing this emergence of greater consolidation of ESG raters and rankers. And so there's this convergence that's happening, which we really see as a really positive sign. I think the other thing to note is that even though their methodologies may be different, there are commonalities between the different raters and rankers. And I think that's encouraging to see, because as a corporate, you know that you're going to be asked similar questions, and the nuances or the differences might be slight from one organization to the other. For us, what we've seen as some of the key success factors in dealing with raters and rankers and these various standards as well, is that it's important to categorize how you're going to engage with them, and also to categorize and understand really well the impact that impact and the indicators, how you're performing against them and so forth. And we almost see we work within these 4 buckets of saying there are certain things that as an organization, we maybe just need to improve our transparency and disclosure on. And that's why even in the work we do, even with Trialogue and so forth on our transparency and our disclosure, we every single year, we continuously say, okay, what else can we add and disclose more information on? So at times, and I've always said, for many who know me, I always say the keys to the kingdom of the ESG raters and rankers world is really disclosure. So if you're more transparent, it goes a long way. The second component is really where as management do we need to improve? You know, what do we need to do differently? Is this something that's in the short term, the medium term, or the long term? So we have what we call an ESG raters and rankers improvement plan. We look at multiple raters and rankers, we rank them, we classify them, and then we actually look at the common elements. So we say, okay, gender pay gap as an example. We say that's coming up in MSCI, in Sustainalytics, and so forth. What are we going to do about it? When are we going to address this? And then ultimately, once we've addressed it, we say, okay, how do we ensure we disclose it? So it's this continuous loop that we have. The other component that we always address is correction. We actually find these instances where information is incorrectly captured by raters and rankers. And what we find is that when we engage them, they actually are willing to take corrections. It just comes down to the company making the time to sit and review and then give the feedback within the assessment cycles so that these corrections can be addressed. The last but the most important is engagements. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we've seen applying these principles, is that we engage a lot with ESG raters and rankers. They make changes or modifications in their methodology almost on an annual basis. So we sit with them and they take us through, okay, they've changed this, they've added this component, even CDP. I was just sitting this morning reviewing CDP, and again, there's improvements in their methodologies, additional questions that come up and so forth. So it's important to continuously engage them to remain abreast. I think there's this perception that ESG raters and rankers don't want to engage. It's, our experience has been fundamentally different. We engage with them numerous times throughout the year, and it's so valuable because it helps us to say, okay, right, does that particular point fall within the transparency, the management, or the correction area? You know, and it's this continuous loop. Lastly, as MTN, because we've applied these principles and this rigor of being clear, almost decluttering the landscape, prioritizing the rating agencies, addressing it from those 4 pillars, we've actually consistently year on year seen improvements in our ESG raters and rankers, and you're welcome to visit our reports where we articulate that. And that is just attributed to the importance, the value, the time you place into it. And that's something that we advise others to do the same. I think what's important as the last point is just that at the end of the day, we have to go back to the North Star. The very reason why we do sustainability is really to drive impact. So ESG is really just how to measure that impact. And if you see it in that way and in that light, you then start to understand the role that ESG raters and rankers play, just to help you see where you are on this journey, and that it's a story of continuous improvement. Thank you very much. Back to you, Matt.
Marina, thank you so much for those insights. And there's just so much in that speech that you made now that I want to ask questions about, you know, and understanding, you know, that whole story around impact and taking and helping MTN on that journey. But we'll get to that in the Q&A section. So thank you very much for that talk. I'll now hand over to Shamila. Before I hand over to you, I just wanted to share the results of the first poll. So David, if you can just share those results. Are they showing? Can everyone see them? I don't know if someone can just let me know if they can see the poll 1 results.
As a panelist, we can definitely see them.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. So just to go back to that first poll that we ran, As I said earlier, that the question was, what is the typical level of response by listed companies to input from raters and rankers? And you can see a clear majority of people are either looking at the substance of inputs across raters and rankers, and that is considered and responded to, or selective and superficial attention response, and not to all raters. So there's definitely room to improve in terms of it, and more understanding I think is needed about raters and rankers. And I think Marina gave some great insights from MTN's perspective about how they use the raters to help them on their own impact journey and storytelling. David, if we can please move on to the next poll question. So the next poll question is open for everyone to answer. The next poll question asks, what level of management attention does the feedback of raters and rankers attract in the business? Active board consideration, exco board subcommittees such as the SEC response to it, investor relations and executives from departments interacting with ESG, the ESG at management level, or no internal attention at all. So if you can answer those questions. And then as we do that, I will hand over to Shamila to begin her presentation.
Thanks, Matthew, and hi everybody on the line. Lovely to be here. Thank you, Matthew and the Trialogue team for the invitation to be here. It's such an interesting topic, and also such a an honor to follow such great speakers as well, who've set the context very, very clearly and makes my job a little bit easier. Matthew, for me, I can come at this from possibly 3 different angles. The first one is that the JSE Limited is a listed company itself. So, itself is being measured by some of these ratings. And of course, we ourselves have to respond to some of those. So there's an internal kind of process that we have there that I could reflect on. The next one is an exchange. And what is the exchange doing in this area more broadly? And how does this impact on the market? And then the third area, I think, is really to reflect a little bit on what I've seen coming through from the number of listed companies that we're engaging on that are dealing with this, right? Who are having numerous ratings that are being leveled at them. Either, they're willingly asking for those ratings, or they're actually being rated anyway and needing to engage with those when the ratings come back and say, here's your review, this is what you look like, and have to engage with that and perhaps provide feedback. If we could share the slides. Oh, sorry, I should be sharing the screen. Please forgive me. I thought that was shared already. Can you just please tell me that you can see them? Matthew, are you able to see the slides?
They're on your screen, Shamila. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you. So just to have a very quick view, I want to take a step back and look at the role of the exchange, because that's a little bit sometimes far-fetched for people to maybe understand and think, where does an exchange play in this area? So this actually talks to the heart of our own strategy as the exchange. And so part of my responsibility is to ensure that I do our own strategy, and we have a theory of change as to how we impact the sustainable development agenda, and therefore what are the levers that we use to be able to drive that impact and therefore act on what we think is our best opportunity to change and to drive towards the aims of sustainable development. So as a marketplace, there are a number of things that we can do, and we have a purpose statement in relation to sustainability, and that encompasses our core purpose as a market, what it wants to do, where we want to position in terms of being a leader in emerging markets, and of course, an explicit acknowledgement of the need to integrate the long term into the market. I think we all are on the same page when we think about the fact that there's an entrenched short-termism in markets. And because sustainability issues tend to be longer term, both in the way they manifest and the way that they can be influenced, that the short-termism sometimes works at odds with the sustainability agenda. And so the need to really think about this with that perspective and be clear about understanding how you impact the long term, but also how you act in the short term is very necessary. And how do we bring that into markets? And therefore, in that context, how are we trying to do something to reduce socioeconomic physical risks, contribute to this enhanced financial stability? Because we're starting to see now that sustainability issues are actually considered to be systemic risks in some instances. And of course, the clear one for that has been for a while climate change, but a number of the others are coming to bear as well. So we've arranged then our activities around a few areas, and you'll see now why this is relevant to where ratings fit in. So we want to guide our markets, firstly, on the importance of ESG disclosure and incorporating sustainability into investment considerations. I'm using ESG here simply simply because it's perhaps an easier acronym for people to understand. But what we're really talking about is sustainability, and I'll get to that in a second. The next one is using our central role as a connector to facilitate engagement and advocacy in relation to sustainability. This comes from the acknowledgement that still this is not widely understood or integrated. And so there's huge opportunity to do that. And if you look at our role as an exchange, we have a great opportunity to be advocates and to provide that engagement lens and to be able to bring together different players in the ecosystem that we influence as an exchange. The third one is behave ourselves, obviously, in a manner that explicitly considers sustainability across our value chain and as a player in the South African economy. And the last one is the tools and services that can factor in responsible investing and, importantly, reorientate capital flows towards more sustainable development. And then when I looked into how we play this out, I'm not going to go in detail to this. Many of you know some of where we factor in on the regulatory context. Engagement and advocacy really is about the panels we sit on, how we try to bring together different players, how we facilitate conversations, and how we partner for the benefit of the market as a whole. But this is the one where really ratings feature perhaps more strongly in terms of how we actually go about trying to create an enabling environment for better disclosure practices, for practices and disclosure, in fact, and very important, not just about disclosure, but practice, right? And saying that sustainability at the heart of it is about good governance, because if you don't have that good governance in play, the chances that your company is really going to take these things into consideration at a serious level really starts reducing, and it has to be embedded in your governance practices at the highest level. And the foundation for that is very well set in South Africa. If you think about the King Codes, the need to consider these issues at the highest level, the governing body. And so we're very fortunate that the governance context in our country facilitates this thinking. And we shouldn't take that for granted because it's not the same in many other jurisdictions. So we have a solid foundation on which to build. So here is where I want to talk a little bit about, firstly, where the most obvious role of ratings comes in. We ourselves, as you know, have an ESG rating that we basically support in the form of the Ftse ESG Ratings using the Ftse for Good model, and that actually underpins our responsible investment indices. And now that has its own model, just like Lee has clearly explained earlier on. Every single one of these has their own model and thinking. And I think important for people on the call to understand is that there's a theory of change, most likely, that each of them has. And that's important to engage on, and Lee very, very articulately set out how you need to be thinking about that. And also, it's not a one size fits all. Everybody will have a different perspective on this, and it's very important for users to understand how that fits in. And Marina's given us great context on that as well. So when we look at this, what is it trying to do? The purpose the JSE had in using ratings was actually twofold. The first one was, yes, we wanted a product that could be investable. And remember, we were the first exchange in the world to actually have an ESG rating to support ourselves, in fact, have an exchange-sponsored ESG index. And so that goes back to 2004, the SRI index that predated the Responsible Investment Index. So the practices then, that is the second purpose of that was that what did it do? It created something aspirational. It encouraged companies to have better practices in disclosure without necessarily mandating maybe 40 metrics that you need to disclose. But once you have a tool and an index that's aspirational, it's encouraging companies to disclose. And as many of you who engage with our ratings know, that it bases only on publicly available information. And so what does that do? It increases transparency in the market. The multiplier effect of that, when you take into account 380 listed companies, is massive. Then the opportunity for multiple stakeholders to engage with that information increases. And what do? Hopefully start driving a more active community of multiple custodians of governance who can engage with companies and really start looking at how that value creation aspect changes in relation to those companies and what they're doing. And so that is where it drives transparency. And that's, I think, a perspective that I wanted to have on ratings. The next one is then very quickly to look at the disclosure guidance, which we released in June this year. And what did we do? We did not want to make more noise in a space that is already hugely noisy. It is voluntary, but what we wanted to do is really understand what pressures our companies were facing, and you'll see that on the next slide. It is exactly this. There are so many ratings, there are so many rankers, there are standards and frameworks that literally come out of your ears. But let's take a step back to first principles, if you like. Almost all of these ratings and framework are based on what? existing standards and frameworks in relation to sustainability. Those in turn should be looking at the context of why are we doing this? What is sustainable development? What are the concepts of boundaries, of thresholds within which our businesses need to operate? And that should be what is occupying our minds. The ratings have an important role to play because they certainly focus corporate attention. We know that just understanding of these issues is not at a very mature stage in many organizations. Even boards grapple with these issues. It's easy to be able to have a number that you can refer to and a set of topics that you can look back on and ask your company, why are you not looking at this, or what are you doing about that? And that is exceptionally useful to be able to start at least at a place. But the step back is hugely important. What is your process of value creation? Are we thinking about what our value is to society as an organization, the business model that we're using, and ultimately what does that mean in terms of those inputs we draw on, the processes we follow to create value, and the outcomes of that value on, for example, the capitals that we draw on. If you think about the integrated reporting model, for example, and a 6 capitals approach. Now, that is a responsibility that you cannot get away from. Every company needs to understand that that is its fundamental question. Why do I exist? And how do I influence these things? And what is my role in either, supporting the aims of sustainable development, or am I simply taking a do less bad approach, a risk-centric approach? And that's where concepts like double materiality come into play. So it's a very complicated one, and I don't want to go too much detail at this point, Matthew, but this is, suffice to say, the kind of the objectives of the guidance that we've put out. And this, I think, is a slide that really sums up when you're feeling confused in this area, this is likely why. And you can see here all the sort of most common and popular standards, ratings, frameworks, and tools. And then, of course, we're sitting with a number of the ratings frameworks that usually have these broader frameworks as their underpinnings. And so it's important to see where those fit together. My biggest concern, I think, when I look at what's happening with companies is that because there's just a proliferation of the ratings, and we know that they do have a value to add, the corporate attention sometimes can be splintered away from understanding the heart of what your business model is, how you're sharing value, how you're creating value, and how you're impacting on sustainable development, and therefore your actual purpose. So if we're chasing ratings for ratings only, and these can be multiple, as you see, I mean, if you listen to Marina, there's hours and hours and many people that are required to do that. And what happens if we're chasing that and we're looking here, we're losing the bigger picture. So I would like to conclude in basically saying that my encouragement to companies is that if you want resilience for the long term, it is your business model that you need to question. You need to use ratings in a way that are helpful to that, but it does not absolve you of your responsibility to understand fundamentally what your value creation process is and know that story very well. Thank you, Matthew. I'll leave it at that.
Shamila, thank you so much. And when you sharing that last slide of all the codes and standards on top of all the ratings and rankers, you start feeling that sense that this is just such a big space to try wrap your head around. And I think what you're saying about really going down to basics of what's material to a company, what's material to your stakeholders, and just being responsible and really doing the best to understand that and report on that. You're doing the best you can. Understand the ratings and rankers, understand the codes and standards, but try at the end of the day to always be true to who you are as a company, understand how you create value, and understand where you might be eroding or destroying value in the long term for other stakeholders. And I think that essence of it really is important, but that at the end of the day, there are large companies that are trying to mature and trying to really live that journey like MTN. So I think it's about where you are as a company, your maturity, and always staying true to yourself and being authentic. Thank you very much.
Can I just add on that is that if you're seeing, that the trend seems to be for more and more ratings to happen, and, it's going to be difficult to decide what that is. So if you don't have that story, actually well told and understood within your organization, it's going to be where you're going to find very much a splintering of attention, and you're not going to be able to keep on the journey that you need to be on. And so to be able to use those carefully and to understand them clearly is going to be very important. But if you don't understand that story, for example, when Anne comes knocking at your door and she wants to engage with you and you actually don't know what your story is, it's going to be difficult to defend some of what you're doing, right? Because she wants to engage beneath the rating. as to what you're doing. And we're seeing that as a trend increasingly with investors, that the rating is useful, but it's one of many inputs that they consider in their broader investment decision-making process. And let's just take a civil society view for a second there. You know, you can have a 5 out of 5 rating, but if you're operating in a community where you're doing damage and they can see that, do you honestly think civil society is going to engage you? Oh, you've got a great rating, you're a great guy. Or is it going to be, but we're fundamentally seeing that the way you're actually destroying value potentially. And I think this is where we need to be able to have a kind of a broader mindset on how we consider these things.
Great. Thank you so much. So now we'll hand over to Matt Whittington-Smith from Farsight and to share some thinking around as a company that does ESG research and provides assessments on company from an ESG perspective. So over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you so much. And hello to everyone here today. As Matthew says, you know, we're one of the raters and rankers. So I think it would be useful for me to actually just take you through what we consider when we analyze companies. You know, and I think we take a different approach to many raters and rankers, but I think it's a kind of next gen ESG approach. And really that's because we use a qualitative model to analyze companies, and we take each company through this qualitative model at a very granular level in order to try and understand how they're engaging with ESG, and it results in a leadership quality score that we have for these companies. So how well is leadership actually engaging with their ESG issues that they have? The first step in this model is to weight issues for their materiality, and we do this at a company specific level. We have our universe of issues there, and we weight each of the issues on a spectrum. But as Anne and Marina have both pointed out, of course, you know, you want to weight issues based on the context that the company finds itself in, and in an emerging market, we have very different issues to take into account then compared to a developed market. So you see in the developed markets, there's a lot of pressure to upweight environmental issues, for example, and of course, climate change is a critical issue for companies to deal with. But in South Africa, you know, we're trying to tackle that with societal concerns, of course. And when you think about the just energy transition, there's of course a trade-off between migrating to renewable energy and lifting people out of poverty and providing them with reliable sources of energy. And that's just one example of the trade-offs that you would consider. And so when we look at weighting materiality, we consider how the costs can be imposed on companies for not engaging with particular areas of ESG. And the second step is then to say, how do we actually rate each of those issues? Now that they have a weighting, a materiality component, how do we rate them? And we look at 4 aspects of rating of an issue, from context and recognition to accountability, so how management actually takes charge and drives the issue, performance reporting, are there KPIs and are they consistent, and finally strategy, which really is how you tie together context, accountability, performance reporting, and strategy. And as you can see, you know, this is a qualitative model. We're analyzing a company's reporting and their publicly available information to understand how they themselves understand these issues, take account for them, report their performance, and provide strategy. And we can rate each of those aspects between -7 and +7. And we think that this is very important for thinking about leadership quality, because well-led businesses build value for owners and society. They solve societal concerns with innovative solutions. They mitigate risks mediated through regulation, and they build long-term value for asset owners. Whereas confused businesses create unsustainable expectations. They can provide unsustainable exuberance that results in harmful market corrections, drive harmful industries into the hands of the unscrupulous, and also destroy value for asset owners. And to finally just finish off with this model, the final leadership quality score that we have is really just the materiality component you have for each issue multiplied by its response score, and we average that over the 20 issues. So of course you really want to be engaging proactively and sincerely, strategically with those high materiality issues, those issues that can impose costs on you. You know, poor scores against those issues will obviously drive down your leadership quality score. But you'll be saying to yourself, you know, that's all well and good. You know, what does that actually mean? And what does the performance of good quality companies look like versus poor leadership quality companies? And in this graph here, we have split out our portfolio into quintiles, and we've just shown the top quintile and the bottom quintile of our universe of companies by leadership quality score versus the all share and cash over time. And you can see that the top quintile of companies, so that 20% of good leadership companies within our South African coverage, which is the top 100, outperforms the all share, but also the bottom quintile quite significantly, and the bottom quintile underperforms the market. And again, this goes back to what we believe with our rating of ESG, and particularly looking at leadership quality, which is about how companies are taking on ESG risk, mitigating that risk, and actually providing competitive advantage versus peers, building resilience into their business models, versus those companies that are potentially unaware of the ESG risk that they have and are dismissive of it, that could potentially be building fragility into their business models. And this model also allows for companies to actually take on ESG risk, which I think is an important thing, particularly in the South African context, that, you know, we are looking for the best leaders to be the custodians of these very complex ESG issues that we face as a country, and to provide innovative solutions for that. So yeah, be very happy to take any questions, and appreciate the time for having me on.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that insightful presentation, and so interesting to see that top quintile performing so well, and the rest really not in that same sort of area. And I'm sure there will be some questions from the attendees on that. Before we move on to questions, let us just share the results from the second poll, which shows that almost 40% of the attendees have ExCo board subcommittees such as the SEC, focusing on feedback from raters and rankers, and 16% active board consideration. So I think you know, there's obviously space for more board interaction here, and then obviously seeing very few people paying no attention at all. So I think there is attention being paid, and it seems to be getting more and more sort of raised higher and higher within the company. So paying more attention to it, and obviously needing to learn more about the space. And then David, if we can just run the third poll then for the attendees, and the third poll should pop up for you shortly. So the third poll is asking the question, what difference do raters and rankers make in shifting existing ESG practices, not just disclosures, being undertaken by the business? And as you answer that question, I'm going to ask my first question to Anne from Alex Forbes, focusing on the unlisted companies. So Anne, how does Alex Forbes assess ESG for unlisted companies, given that information is less readily available when compared with the listed sector? And then there was a question from one of the attendees asking, are there any benchmarks for unlisted investments? So if you could perhaps tackle that question.
Yeah. Thanks, Matthew. So, I mean, as I said earlier, it's a lot easier to get data for the listed space, but obviously the unlisted space forms a large part of our fund allocation. So we do have to have some sort of an ESG approach to it. So effectively, we have a targeted focus area linkage in terms of our private markets. We refer to as private markets, which are effectively linked to the SDG targets. So there are 5 metrics that we look at in private markets, and that effectively will then form our ESG ranking for all our private market fund allocation. Firstly will be green transition. I did mention earlier that obviously, our view is responsible green transition. I'm sure you would all have seen, Germany, for example, has reopened coal plants. Europe is calling on corporates and citizens to reduce energy demand and things like that. So obviously regulation and laws that were made a number of years ago, in my mind, from a point of privilege, have now come almost back to the fore, and there's now reconsideration as to whether those were sustainable decisions or rules that were set in place. So when we say responsible green transition, we do consider the fact that we have a lot of mining companies in this country. Do we exclude? No, we don't exclude. So it's green transition. Job creation is critical to us. So if a fund presents, it should be able to say, when we allocate funds, it will invest in an industry, in infrastructure that will possibly develop jobs in our country. We look at diversity. We look at education. Does it contribute to those? And then lastly, we look at health and safety. So we've effectively created our own sort of ranking based on obviously SDG targets, but that's how we then are able to effectively create an ESG ranking for the private market space.
So I lost my unmute tab there. So thanks very much for that answer. And then if I could move over to MTN, to Marina. So it would be interesting to hear the perspective of an issuer with regards to your experience with various local and international raters and rankers. Do you have any insights into what approaches might best reflect the true ESG performance of a business such as MTN? And also then just following on from that question, just in terms of the impact that it has, do you see impact playing out with your stakeholder engagement process out of all of this? Do you see the results of all this work actually showing, how does that impact play out in the company? So you do a lot of work in the space, and you talked about impact in your earlier speech. So how does that play out?
Yeah. So I think just in terms of how best to sort of approach being an issuer, engaging with organizations. So I've given a little bit of insight in terms of how we approach them. I think the other dynamic that we see is not only the more general ESG raters and rankers, but you also see the I can't say the rise, because they've always been there and they remain there. But there's, there's different sort of indexes that help gauge aspects on a topical level. So you find like CDP is most commonly used for climate change. In the digital space, we look at like ranking digital rights and so forth. So there's an importance to ensure that there's, as you work with these raters and rankers as a corporate, that you find a fine balance between the more general ESG raters and rankers and then the more topic specific indexes, because the combination of the two is what, like Shamila said, helps drive business practices, that helps to inform what you do, that really enhances things. When you look at impact specifically, we engage a lot with various levels of stakeholders. As an example, our investors, and without a doubt, we work very closely with our group investor relations department, and we get a lot of requests for discussion specifically on ESG. We do have, the overall results roadshows, with the governance roadshows, and all of that. But a lot of the investors actually ask for one-on-one engagements. And during those conversations, you find that they do use raters and rankers. So they'll ask you questions. They'll say, we've seen this in this rating. What's your view on it? We've seen it something on CDP. What's your view on it? And so forth. But what's interesting enough, exactly as was mentioned earlier by Anne, a lot of the investors use their own methodology. So they use a combination of approaches, and the feedback we often get from investors. The conversation is almost day and night. From 2-3 years ago to today, they sit there and they say, we've seen such progress that you've made in your ESG, in your disclosure. We really believe, that helps us to invest in you, and I think it's a positive sign. I saw the study that Lee was saying earlier, which is, can you make a direct correlation? Obviously, at times it's difficult to sort of quantify and say, okay, our share price has gone up, or ESG contributes this much to our share price. It's very difficult to quantify it, but we do see it, and our investor relations department keeps track of what are the drivers to shifts in our ESG pricing, interest in MTN and so forth, as an example. And ESG is a factor that contributes, especially as you look at your diverse portfolio of shareholders and investors, which come from Europe, from the US, but also from South Africa and other parts of the world. They are using it more and more to inform their decision making. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Marina. Thanks for that insight. Shamila, then a question for you. With regards to the JSE responsible investing indexes, which appear to be outperforming their benchmarks, do you expect to see a convergence between these indexes and their benchmark indexes as the overall market improves performance and disclosure on sustainability matters over time?
Sure. I wish I had that crystal ball, Matthew, to understand. So ideally, that would be the world we want to aim for, right? That our disclosure is great, our practices are better, and we probably don't even need a separate ESG or sustainability benchmark. It is a difficult one, and there's a number of underlying factors. It's right. The market benchmarks themselves might change, and so the relative difference between them could change. The second thing is that the actual underlying rating models in terms of sustainability also change, because as we become more and more efficient at understanding the sustainability challenge, that then factors into how the ratings models themselves change. So I think we've got too many moving parts to make a decision, or make kind of a prediction right now as to exactly what that convergence or divergence might look like. So Matthew, sorry, it's not a complete answer, but I think that's not an easy one to predict going into the future. But I think what we're hoping is that the fundamental value of those companies will start to shift as their practices become embedded. And so, their opportunity to actually be longer term investment prospects, their resilience going into the future, and the actual long-term, viability of those business models is really what we're hoping that the change in practices and the understanding of these issues will change.
Thanks. And while you're here, I just want to ask one question that came from one of the attendees. It said, how does the JSE ensure the market realities of RSA for 300 top companies listed are addressed, as current ESG rating providers of JSE covers only a few big names? Thank you, Andrew Bogner, for that question.
Sure. So, I mean, the thing is that, firstly, the JSE firstly offers the services that we have in terms of companies' access to the ratings free of charge, and I think that's very important. The exchange is actually sponsoring that. So the fact that our companies have access to the Ftse ratings, the portal that sits behind that, and analysis of that, and the engagement that they have is actually at no additional cost to them. And so we've been sponsoring that to promote that disclosure in the market. At currently, we cover 160 companies in terms of that. So is by and large the majority of the market cap of all of our listed companies. And we know that gap, there is a gap obviously between the balance of those. But as we're aiming for investable indices, we certainly have that covered in the companies that we do have, and we're providing ratings for. The next thing on that is that the JSE guidance actually is there to help all companies to start improving their practices and their disclosure and fundamentally changing, right, the way they behave in relation to sustainability, their understanding, and the ability to integrate that into their thinking. So the guidance is there for everybody, and obviously could apply to beyond listed companies. So it's the combination of these two that I think one needs to consider, and then to understand that there are multiple ratings that cover the market. And so companies can consider other ratings should they find those to be valuable as well. So we by no means think that we're the one size fits all for everything, but we do cover at this stage about 160 companies.
Great, thank you so much for that answer. If I can hand over to Matt at Farsight. One question came from the attendees asking whether you engage with the top 100 companies, do you communicate with the companies that you analyze? And sort of with that question, I'd like to ask you, given that you're working with information of many JSE listed companies day in and day out and over many years, what advice would you give to companies to improve their performance as well as the disclosure of that performance?
Yeah, thanks for that. Regarding the first question, we don't engage directly with companies. We're doing, this granular analysis of the top 100, and we found that, in order to keep our process separate from companies, because we do perform a qualitative analysis, we want to keep that arm's length relationship with the companies that we have. We don't want to be swayed by the charisma of management or anything like that. So we look at all the companies' publicly available information. We analyze that and put our methodology and our scoring together. And the way that we also disseminate that research into the market is through asset managers. And so we've been very kind of vocal with them about the fact that they can use our research to then engage with their companies, using our research, using our findings. And we think that that's the best way to keep our process kind of insulated from the charisma of management. And then onto the second question about how companies could improve their disclosure. I think that one of the main topics that has been brought up, of course, is that there are so many different providers. They're all looking to kind of hoover up metrics and provide different standards. And I think that the advice I would give is for companies to really stick to what they define as their material landscape. What are those material issues for them to deal with? Of course, all these different metrics and indices are going to be asking you to provide detail and KPIs into different areas, and those might be indices that are based in the US or the developed markets in Europe, that might have more weighting placed on environmental issues, for instance, or might use only industry level materiality weightings, but rather understand what are your core issues as a company that you need to deal with. Where can costs be imposed on you across how you have where you're operating within different geographies, how you interact with host governments, what types of products you sell, what communities do you impact. Those are all areas that can impose costs on you as a company, even how you've structured your governance, and you need to be able to understand what each of those areas are, and then in your response, go through those 4 different aspects of response. Response goes beyond just providing a metric for an issue, but rather, understanding that context, providing leadership accountability, having KPIs that are consistent over time and show, progress and meeting of targets, and then, tie that together into a strategy that makes sense for your business. Because I think ESG in this way, particularly in the South African market, we really have to focus on a company-specific level and analysis of these companies to really understand how they're engaging with these different issues.
Nola Richards, who asked that first question, had a follow-up question asking, how does a rated company get to know that they've been rated badly, and how would they know that the score has been attributed to them?
So we publish our ratings we publish them through the asset managers and also online. Not all companies are rated badly, but some of the I think it really depends on how companies want to interact with these issues and with these raters and rankers. This is all about how companies and the asset management industry really uses and views raters and rankers. So in some cases, companies just don't want to deal with it and will, largely ignore it. And in some cases, we've had, companies come back to us and say, oh, we've, heard through our shareholders that we've been rated on your Farsight model. Can you explain why that's the case, or why we have this score? And those interactions have, kind of ranged across the spectrum of being positive and constructive to somewhat less so. So I think there's a variety of ways in which companies can find out whether they're rated, and we're also happy to interact with them after the fact and explain their score.
Matthew, thank you very much for that. I'm going to open to the floor more generally now. So there was a hand earlier from Dennis. So David, if you can just allow Dennis to use his camera or microphone to ask that question. And Dennis, please explain who you'd like to, who you're asking the question to, and your question, please.
Sorry, thank you, Mark. And it was a mistake. It wasn't intentional. I'm enjoying the session. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Dennis. Okay, so then any other hands, any other attendees who'd like to ask a question? As that's happening, I'm just going to go to
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Anne mentioned a very important issue of saying some first world countries tend to think that everything can work anywhere, which is, I mean, in KIM 4, we talk about proportionality considerations. Now, I wanted to know how are you faring with convincing them that this should be situational? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So, I mean, I suppose this is why we have engagements like this. We do find that what we are seeing of late is there is a lot more local providers. Matthew has spoken to the fact that, there is providers out there that do have a South Africa specific nuance. And we are challenged. I mean, I don't know how many people on the line are aware of the fact that in Europe now there's these Article 8, I don't know if I call it compliant funds or funds that work with a new regulation there called Article 8, which effectively means that you are not allowed to invest in companies that are not ESG compliant. And the problem with that is when you are looking at it from a South African landscape, our benchmarks are not required to be Article 8 compliant. I think I'm saying it wrong, it's not compliant, but our benchmarks don't require that. And if you look at the performance of those funds relative to the non-constrained benchmarks, they've actually not done as well in the past year, simply because energy stocks, given the energy crisis that we've had offshore, have outperformed the index. So the unconstrained benchmarks are looking a lot better. So it remains a challenge for all of us. And we do at all times, in every decision that we make, keep our members at heart, which is the South African investor. So we understand the South African investor landscape. We understand the South African investor need. And with the assets that we allocate, we also ensure that we use that leverage to the best advantage of our members.
Thank you for that question. Any other questions from the attendees? David, if you can facilitate. Before we go there, Lee, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, well, I've got another question for Anne, actually. Just understanding how Alex Forbes takes ESG into account in the unlisted space. It's a really fascinating space, and I think it genuinely is a blind spot where more needs to be done. It would be interesting to hear, with regards to your approach, whether you factor in the size of the organization in terms of what you would expect of them from a disclosure point of view to you. On the basis that many unlisted companies can be significant in size, and in many cases larger than companies that are even listed on the JSE. From a size and impact point of view, as well as then obviously in a smaller company, it may be more difficult for those companies to put resources into disclosing and measuring and managing all of these issues. That's the first part of my question. And along the same vein, I guess, to ask the question as to whether you have any exposure to state-owned entities, for example, credit lines or in the fixed income space, and whether and how you deal with state-owned entities from an ESG perspective, if that's relevant in your space. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. So in terms of size, obviously, you know, the issue is where can you have impact, right? So AF Invest has got just under 450 billion rand. And around 13% of that is invested in the private market space. So those of you who are better at maths than I am can do that calculation. But ultimately, we impact or we affect ESG where we allocate funds. You know, we're not a ratings agency, so it's difficult for me to go to all private markets and say, this is how you guys should approach ESG. We simply engage with the guys who come to us. And we have got very clear criteria around who we allocate funds to in the unlisted space. And you have to be able to talk to the 5 metrics I mentioned earlier. So there must be a positive impact related to the SDG targets that we are able to see in how you approach what you are going to do with the assets we give you, as well as creating a sustainable end result effectively for whichever economy or environment in which you operate. And then the second question was around state-owned entities. So yes, we do have exposure to some state-owned entities, but those go through the same rigorous credit process or credit rating process that every other credit or paper that we hold goes through. So generally we tend to hold obviously A-rated paper or government-backed paper in terms of state-owned entities. I reiterate the point I made earlier that remember that this is not my money that I'm managing. It is money that effectively belongs to widows and orphans. All of us have got pension funds because we are trying to make sure that we are able to survive when we are in retirement and that we are able to leave something for our children and our spouses in the event that something happens to us. So we've got to make sure that never at any point are we risking financial loss to the money that we've got. That's got to be priority for all of us. So when it comes to state-owned entities, they go through as rigorous a credit process as every other credit paper that we would hold. And any manager that is allocated debt money has to be able to show a very rigorous credit process in their investment process.
Thanks so much for that. If I could ask Nobantu, you've got your hand raised if you'd like to ask your question.
Sorry, Matthew, I think it's Pumelele.
Oh, first, sorry, David, please go follow your Pumelele, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. I have 2 specific questions, and it's not really specific to anybody at the panel, but I think Matthew will be better positioned to answer. The first one is regarding large corporations who have a variety of product offering or services versus a specialized entity. When we look at ESG reports, for an example, a financial institution who offers different services or products into the market, and you try to benchmark yourself as a specialized entity, it becomes very difficult to understand their ratings or what their communication or what their report is saying. So I just wanted to understand, as a rating agency, is there a way or is there a thought and an approach in which you can break down such a large corporation, so it speaks to even specialized entities? That's my first question. And then the second one, this one I think Marina might be best positioned to answer it, but once again, it's open to all panelists to respond to. It's regarding the manner of approach in regards to disclosure, because based on how I was listening on your presentation and what I've seen with the research as well, is that it seems there's a behavior of rather organization putting out the information that contributes to raters and rankers, rather than having a very specialized way of providing your own reports. So I just wanted to understand or be well advised if an organization can rather have their own report, and would it still carry the same weight and have the same understanding in regards to the language of a report that is done based on just information disclosure?
Who wants to answer? Matthew, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. Maybe I can just ask Siphumelele if you could just provide some clarity on what you mean by a specialized entity versus, like a large financial corporation like a bank, in that context.
So if we look within a bank, you are looking at an institution that will provide savings accounts where a client can have easy access to their monies, and then you have an organization which would only take your money and invest for you for a long period of time. A bank can do that as well, and they would offer another product like a home loan or a life policy. So you're looking at a large corporation that is diversified, and when you look at their ESG report, it doesn't really speak to we are measuring purely based on this operation or this performing product. So you're looking at the organization as a whole, and when you are a specialized entity, so you cannot really relate. As much as you are both within the financial sector, you don't do the same thing. So you cannot benchmark yourself with the large corporations which are already out there when it comes to ESG reporting.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the way that we think about it, and in a lot of these cases, we also run up against the same issue where the reporting by the company doesn't go granular enough into specific product lines that you can analyze each of those individual product lines. And that's where I think the materiality process is so important, because you're trying to highlight what those critical issues of importance are, and within a bank, of course, those revolve around product suitability and treatment of customers as particular issues. We will rate what we can find by the company, and of course, if there are critical issues that are dismissed or they don't provide metrics for, that can be penalized. But I think what we are very focused on within our universe of coverage, when we look at financial companies, we really want to look at the differences in materiality between the likes of a Capitec versus an Investec. They of course are both banks, but placed very differently in the South African context. And then, for the likes of Capitec, they'll have a lot more weighting around product suitability. So, responsible lending as a particular issue. And they will particularly provide good scoring around their debtors book and their loan book. But going into individual product lines, it is quite difficult to find that data. We do the best that we can, and we report what we can find. But I can understand that for a specialized entity, it's hard to benchmark yourselves against these larger corporates. A lot of that information is just summarized or not provided. And we can't mark up a company if they don't have that information reported. So I know that's probably not a very fulfilling answer, but this is one of the issues that you run into when doing ESG rating and ranking, is the information is not very standardized across entities. There's not a specific way that people report, so you just have to kind of deal with what you get.
Okay. I am afraid that we are running out of time. I'd just like to say that all questions that are posed on the chat into the Q&A will be communicated with the panelists, and we will provide a response to you. So all questions will be answered. but there's no more time for any more questions now. So I'm just going to ask each of the panelists, as per the order of presentation, Anne, Marina, Shamila, and Matt, to please just provide very, very short closing statements, and then we will hand over to Julie from the IODSA to provide some closing remarks. Thank you, Anne.
Cool, thank you. So I suppose maybe in closing, I'd maybe like to talk briefly to, just how we are able to evidence ESG integration, because I think, and it was related to the question that Spumelelo asked earlier, was around just the different ways in which ESG is presented by different companies, by different fund managers, and even by different ESG raters. It's a bit like when you take a photo, right? Most of us tend to take it from our good side all the time, and then nobody ever really sees that you've got, I don't know, some mark or whatever that you're trying to hide on the wrong side. And this is effectively kind of what you do. Is investor reports will tend to show the good things and tend to hide the things they don't want to see. But effectively, we are saying that there has to be an evidencing beyond a rating. A rating is mere data. You have to be able to then call it to task. We ask for evidence from fund managers. When you talk to ESG, we are then saying, how do you show that you have actually walked the talk? Have you sent shareholder letters to management? Have you voted accordingly and constantly, or are you a shareholder that is a lazy shareholder that never bothers to engage in proxy votes of any sort? What research are you able to show us as investors that you take ESG seriously, and it is not something that you simply say you do because you are trying to gather assets from an AF Invest, as an example? And we are saying that, and actually this is where we are quite glad that the JSE has come out with almost a standardized requirement for listed companies in particular, because we do need to have some uniformity that we are all working towards. But obviously uniformity becomes difficult because what is important to one investor is not necessarily important to the next investor. But maybe just to close off, to say we are all learning. We are happy to engage with anybody who would like to educate us on what we could do better, what we could do more of, as well as how we approach ESG going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, for your time.
Thanks, Matt. So I think just 4 points from my side. One, I think we need to keep advocating for the emerging market context. So I'm glad, Shamila was able to share what JSE is doing, Matt is sharing what they're doing. So I think as Africans, we need to be part of the conversation and not let it happen to us. So I love the proactiveness of that. And I think we need to keep advocating for that emerging market context. The realities of these global standards that are coming are really in a different setting, in a different context where poverty levels are different, unemployment is different. Climate change isn't quite in the same context. It's more climate resilience on this continent. So our realities are different. We need to keep putting that lens and advocating for it. Two, I think we need to keep staying abreast of what is happening. ESG raters and rankers are trying to figure it out as they go along. This area is new to them too. It's evolving. So we also just need to keep engaging with them to help them evolve and remain realistic and appropriate. And I think that's really key. And I think with Spumelo's question of trying to get rating agencies to narrow down further to product streams, the honest truth from what I've seen is that they don't always have the answers. They're also trying to figure out, then they'll say, okay, right, you're categorized in this sector for this, but like MTN, we have mobile money. Are they going to start then categorizing us in the financial sector as well? So there's no set answer. It's evolving and it's fluid, and you have to stay abreast of that. And then transparency is key. And transparency, yes, there's reporting standards that help to drive disclosure, but transparency can be tailored and defined to every company. And we see it every day as we engage rating agencies. They accept anything that is in the public domain, whether it's a position statement, something you put on your website, a brochure, as long as you can reference it and go see, link here, page so-and-so, they'll take it. So just make sure that whatever you do is as public as possible. There are a few that accept internal documents. I'm always very averse to those because you always have to take confidentiality, and they do try and protect confidentiality. But my advice is always go public, you know, put what you can and what you feel comfortable and disclose. And then last but not least, let's not lose sight of why do we do what we do. It's really about impact. And at the end of the day, it's about bringing others with us, changing lives, making a difference. And as MTN, and I think a lot of other boards are getting involved. We recently had Sustainalytics come in and present to our board and take them through their methodology. And we had the same conversation with them around the emerging market context. And so take people with you, have the conversation more broader, and remember that at the end of the day, it is about impact. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you so much, Marina. Thanks for coming and sharing your insights. Shamila.
Thanks, Matthew. I'm going to pick up sort of where Marina left off and start with saying we mustn't lose sight of the goal. And what is it that we're ultimately trying to drive when we're talking about sustainability, and where ratings, framework, standards fit in that broader context. I think not enough is being said or understood about things like thresholds, planetary boundaries, the need to ensure social foundations in the context of a set of boundaries. And that is where there's, I think, perhaps more education that is helpful to be able to know what is it that you're trying to influence. You know, we sometimes tick the boxes, but the what is a very important question, because that's the one you fundamentally want to engage your board and your management teams on, because that's about ultimately maintaining your social license to operate. And as we're starting to see, for example, increased shareholder activism in our country as well, we've seen that happen. And then, you know, things like even litigation starting to increase globally. Climate change, of course, being the area where that's starting the most. And as you might expect, we're seeing a lot of that increase in jurisdictions like the US. But these are some of the pressures that are coming to bear. And so more and more starting to ask ourselves the question of the why. And why are we doing this? And understanding that that pressure is coming to bear on saying, how do we maintain our social license to operate? You know, a company exists to add value to society, and the way it creates that value is fundamentally important to do that. And so using these tools and the standards and the frameworks to be able to help understand that context is critically important. Knowing what's material to you, and then using that as the basis to start communicating with your stakeholders, then helps us to go to more meaningful disclosure. And of course, you know, there might be certain stakeholders that want a particular rating. And so you're going to be able to do disclosures. You're going to need to do disclosures that meet that stakeholder's material to you. But what is important is understanding that context, I think, and that story that you do is something that you can hold true to and do that in a sincere way. And that no matter who kicks the tires, they'll be able to understand that value creation process.
All about value creation at the end of the day. Thank you so much, Shamila, for your time. I really appreciate it. Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I can just echo what all the other panelists have said, and you know, that's really about and what Farsight is about is finding the best leaders to engage with ESG. I mean, you know, we don't want to shy away from ESG or you know, make companies scared of ESG, but rather take on ESG. You know, find innovative solutions to the societal and environmental problems that we have in this country. And you want to see the leaders be the custodians of that, and show that they can engage with it strategically. And that's really what we're looking for. We're looking for the best leaders in the South African market to engage with these issues and show that they can step up to the plate and tackle them. You know, I think that's what's going to slowly drive these issues forward. And as Shamila was saying, and you know, really build a coherent story around it. It's not just about complying with the specific metrics or, you know, being able to comply with all the different standards out there, but rather build a coherent story about what you're doing around ESG and keep focused on what is material to you as a business.
it's all about materiality at the end of the day, and understanding what's material to your business, and really keeping that finger on the pulse. Thank you so much for your insights from Farsight, Matt. Before we hand over to Julie from the Institute of Directors to close, I'd just like to share the last poll results, basically asking the question, what difference do raters and rankers make in shifting ESG practices? And 42% say it's important. It's one of the key driving forces impacting management decisions. That's excellent to see. And also makes it more important to understand the sphere. Significant, it drives changes where convenient or where there are obvious gaps. 0% of the participants say that they are not impacted. So you can start seeing that there's a, as I think with all the other poll questions, the answers really were in the middle here, that a significant amount of focus is moving into this direction. There's obviously, it's not fundamental, it's not the most important, but it certainly is receiving quite a lot of attention. So a very insightful poll that. So I'll now just hand over to Julie to close. So thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Matthew. Appreciate that. And thank you to our panelists. ESG is an important board agenda item, not least because of the organization's ESG credentials that affect investor confidence, but increasingly its social license to operate. While the importance of ESG is easy to conceptualize, nailing down the details of what concrete actions the board must take and then disclose on is a little bit harder. This is why webinars and discussions such as this one are critical to build a bigger awareness and a better awareness of the methodologies relating to ESG and ESG performance. So I would just like to thank everyone who participated today as a panelist and who logged on and came to hear the message that our panelists have to share. And I appreciate the collaboration that we've had with Trialogue to get this message across to everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you to the panelists, as you said, and to all the attendees. This is the end of the webinar. It will be, the recording will be shared with all registered attendees, and a write-up will be shared as well. The polls will be shared as well. Any questions, as I said, that were not answered by the panelists will be shared with them, and we will provide answers to you. So once again, thank you from Trialogue, and thank you from the Institute of Directors. I hope you have a good day further. Thank you.